Hey, and welcome back to my study. I want to talk today about this question of toxic versus redeemed masculinity. And if you haven't heard that term, toxic masculinity, it's kind of been in the culture and in the news and in public discourse a little bit in the last couple years especially. It was probably around before that. But when I started hearing it was just a couple of years ago. We had first one and then another and then a whole slew of brave women in Hollywood coming out and exposing the ways that they had been sexually harassed, sexually abused, even sexually assaulted by powerful men, movie directors, people who could make or break your career, and men who used that power that they had in order to abuse these women and exploit these women sexually. And after they came out, it was like the floodgates opened all across, particularly the entertainment, the media industries, but in other areas too, in politics and so forth. Women began to step up and bravely say, "Me too. Me too. I've been abused. I've been harassed. I've been assaulted sexually. We have a problem with masculinity in this country," is what people began to say. I mean, look, all these women are coming out. This whole Me Too movement was gaining steam. And people were saying, we have a problem. We have a problem with masculinity. There's something has gone wrong. We have a toxic masculinity. Of course, almost immediately, this issue of toxic masculinity became somewhat controverted. What is toxic masculinity? What is that all about? There are some forms of feminism, and if you've studied feminism, you know there's first wave, second wave, third wave. There are different kinds of feminism. There are some varieties of feminism that view all masculinity as toxic because they see the entirety of human history as a story of men abusing and harassing and exploiting women. And that is the lens they use to understand all of human history, this power dynamic of competition between men and women. And so they kind of said, well, yeah, the problem is masculinity itself. That is, by definition, toxic. And so the solution, I guess, is for men to be less masculine somehow. And this is a very, very problematic view for a number of reasons. I mean, it's a false reading of history. Not all of human history is about men, beating up on women or dominating women or abusing women. I mean, much of human history in terms of the relationship between the sexes has been about men and women, husbands and wives, struggling to provide for their family, to put food on the table, to raise their kids up right, being on the same page with a common goal. And that's totally missed in this ideology, which, like a lot of contemporary ideologies, boils everything down to power, which misses so much of the human experience. I mean, what about love? What about altruism? You know, as a Christian, I think that's kind of a big deal. Now, there are other people, including other kinds of feminists, who said, no, that's not fair. You can't just lump all men together as if they were all the same. That's not just, and say that all men are the problem. But it is a certain kind of behavior, a certain kind of masculinity, and certain problematic men that really are the issue. And so we need to talk about this. We need to figure this out. We need to improve what we're doing as masculinity in our culture. Unfortunately, and I think that's true, I think they raise a very important question. Unfortunately, the whole Me Too movement, I think, like some of the other movements that immediately preceded it, became very politicized very quickly. You saw this with the Justice Kavanaugh hearings, for example. And so, because it became politicized, almost immediately, half of the country lost interest, which is a shame for such an important conversation. It needs to be a nonpartisan issue. It needs to be above politics. And some men, of course, lost interest just because they felt like they, as men, were being unfairly attacked. And so this whole conversation about toxic masculinity, I think it's died down a little bit from where it was a year and a half, 2 years ago. But I think it's still actually a really important issue, a really important problem, because I would argue, as a classic Christian, that we do have a crisis of masculinity in our culture today. We have a culture that has no coherent and good and beautiful vision about what masculinity is all about. We don't have rites of passage that help boys to understand what it means to be a man and to know that they have become men. We have this confusion about what man manhood really is. And I think that contributes to everything from the libertine hookup culture on our college campuses to domestic violence and even gender identity confusion. All of these things are different ways that men are trying to grapple with, what is it for me to be a man? I'm not sure. I'm confused. I have angst about this. And I think you can see this confusion in a lot of ways. I think about it something as simple as 20-somethings and even 30-somethings who refer to the men in their life not as men, but as guys. We're much more comfortable talking about guys than about men. And that, I think, is a little linguistic thing that speaks volumes. It's almost as if we're not really sure if they are men. What is a man? We have a crisis of masculinity right now. And having a common, coherent vision of what a strong and good masculinity is all about. And I think there are lots of ways that you can see that our culture, as a culture, is very confused at this particular moment. I'll share just two examples, one kind of public and one personal. You may have heard earlier this year, British police arrested a man on sex-related charges. However, because he was wearing a wig and told the police he identified as a woman, they put him in, and this, Britain's like the most politically correct country in the world, they put him in an all-women detention center, where almost immediately he proceeded to sexually assault some of the actual women, the female inmates who were housed at that center. Closer to home, about a year ago, I was talking to a young man about my age, in his 30s, who has a little boy who's a toddler, and we got to talking about parenthood. We both have young children. And I made the comment, you've got this awesome and serious task ahead of you to train up your little boy into what it means to be a man. And my friend kind of shrugged his shoulders and laughed and said, as soon as I figure out what that means, I can start working on that. And I think both of those examples just highlight the fact that our culture is deeply confused and deeply ambivalent about what is masculinity. What's it all about? What does it mean to be a man? What would a good and holy, a redeemed masculinity even look like? We need answers to these questions. Boys need to know what they are aiming at as they try to grow into men. Girls need to know what they should be looking for in husbands. Our culture, however, sends a lot of very mixed signals, whether it's in pop music or rap music or action movies or what the politicians are saying or what the news media is reporting. There are all kinds of and what churches are saying. There's a whole bundle of mixed messages and contradictory messages that are out there floating around. Yet despite all this confusion, we know masculinity is powerful and it is here to stay, and we need to figure out what to do with that. I mean, every child knows that men and women are different. Men, physically different, are generally taller, heavier than women. They have greater muscle mass and bone density. Our bodies are filled with a hormone called testosterone, which makes men more physically aggressive and more willing to take physical risks. And you could look at that and say men have more physical courage than women, or you might just say men are more reckless, and it's kind of depends on the situation, maybe. That is, of course, why a 20-year-old young man is going to be paying more for car insurance than a woman the same age, because not the car insurance countries are arbitrarily being sexist and discriminating against young men, but they know from experience that men and women are different, and we behave different, and they take that into account in their insurance business. That's just the way the world really is, and they know that. That's also why, though my wife is actually taller than I am, bigger than I am, heavier, I am much stronger than she is. It's my job to open all the salsa jars, right? I'm stronger, I'm faster than she is, because men and women are different. Men's bodies are not geared toward childbearing the way that women's bodies are. And all of these simple biological realities, undeniable facts of our nature, they make men and women different, and they make it the case that men are typically more physically threatening and dangerous toward women than the other way around. Typically, men are more dangerous toward women than the other way around, and that's why domestic abuse, more often than not, is men abusing women and not the other way around, though that, of course, does happen. So masculinity is powerful. No doubt about it. Masculinity is powerful. It always has been. And like anything powerful, yes, it can become very dangerous, very toxic. So what do we do with this? That's the question. Now, the Bible teaches that both men and women are created in the image of God. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. This is important for a number of reasons. For one, both masculinity and femininity, in their different ways, both reflect the character of God. And they are both gifts from God, shared with the human race. And that also means in a world where you can pick from something like 60 different gender identities on Facebook to describe yourself, to identify with, the truth is we don't have to come up with our own gender identity and make ourselves up on our own. God gives our masculinity and our femininity to us as a gift. And that's actually very liberating. It sets people, especially young people, free from this angst of having to figure out what sort of being they are. I don't have to wring my hands in angst wondering if I'm supposed to be a man or if I'm supposed to be something else. My masculinity is given to me. It's a gift. I am a man. It's not fluid. It is a given. And that is actually a liberating gift. And it clarifies my mission. For me, my mission is to be a man, the best sort of man that I can be. Now, I am convinced that toxic masculinity is the solution to this. The way to address toxic masculinity is to be found in the Bible and in the Christian tradition. I'm a Christian, and I think there's actually so much wisdom that our culture has neglected and lost sight of and even forgotten that would be so helpful for us in the moments, the cultural moment that we find ourselves in now. The solution, for example, to toxic masculinity is not less masculinity or somehow a ridiculous attempt to have no masculinity. That's not even possible physically and biologically. Rather, the solution is redeemed masculinity. And perhaps that's better known in our Western culture as chivalry. Chivalry, this is a uniquely Christian ideal. It didn't develop in other civilizations. It developed in Christian medieval Europe, precisely because it was a Christianized civilization. The word chivalry is related to the French word chevalier, which means a knight, a horse soldier, a soldier, a warrior on horseback. Christian knights were not only expected to be skillful warriors, and they were powerful in battle, but they were also expected to live by a code of conduct, a code of chivalry, as we often call it. And that was important because in the Middle Ages, the knight was the special forces operator of his day. He was the alpha male. He was the most dangerous man in the room wherever he found himself. And because he could be threatening and dangerous to pretty much everyone around him, it was especially important for him to live by this code of chivalry that would channel his power and channel it in virtuous and community-serving ways rather than in destructive ways. If you read some of the old literature, chivalry presents the ideal of a man who fights for what is right and is fierce in battle, but also gentle and courteous when he's at the banquet table with the ladies, for example. He is meek and reverent and regular in the worship of God and in doing his duties as a Christian. And he's also assertive and active. He's not passive, he's active in pursuing noble and godly goals. Chivalry presents us with the ideal of a man who is a saintly soldier. He is a protector, he is a provider, and he is pious. That's what you might boil that down to. He's pious, meaning he does his duty toward God, but also he does his duties toward his community and his fellow man. Now, there are many symbols associated with this ideal of chivalry and knighthood, and chief among them is this one. This is the sword of a knight. This is an arming sword. It's a sword that's designed to be wielded one hand so that it can be wielded from horseback. This is the sword of a knight. And in medieval Europe, of course, a man might pass down this sword from generation to generation, from father to son to grandson, and so on. And it would be a symbol of their family and their commitment to knighthood. And the sword is a great symbol in many ways. It was used during the dubbing ceremony that, of course, made a man a knight, as the sword was touched to his shoulders, and he was dubbed a knight by his lord or his sovereign or a bishop or archbishop or some person in authority. But the interesting thing about the sword is the shape that it takes. If you study ancient history or medieval history, basically every culture around the world that developed the art of metalworking developed some form of the sword. And they come in all shapes and sizes. They come straight or curved, they come short or long, they come single or double-edged. But only in Christian Europe did the sword take this shape. This is a cruciform sword. This is a cross-shaped sword. This is even called the cross guard. It's a cross-shaped sword. And that's very significant. This was not only a weapon, it was for the medieval knight also a religiously significant symbol. Because it reminded him that his physical strength, his physical courage, that almost recklessness that he has as a man, was to be used in the service of King Jesus. His strength, his power, and even his ability to fight and be fierce in battle was to be used in the service of the kingdom of God. It was to be used for the defense of other people, and it was to be channeled in a way that was consistent with the teachings of Jesus Christ and Christianity. His strength was to be harnessed in ways that were virtuous and consistent with the Bible. And so the sword represents a kind of the danger of masculinity being willingly surrendered to the kingdom and the lordship of Jesus Christ. And it was their dedication to this principle, at least in principle, this ideal. Of course, certainly not every medieval knight, we know this obviously from history, lived up to this ideal, but their dedication to this ideal is why knights were so highly valued in the medieval period, particularly the monastic orders of knights who were also monks, such as the Knights Templar and the Knights of the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem. These knights were extremely highly regarded, and they were held in great esteem throughout Christian Europe. And you can see that in the great gifts that people left to them in their wills and whatnot. And if you read the literature of the medieval Romance, you're reminded that the chivalrous gentleman who lives up to this ideal, the knight, was supposed to always speak the truth, always keep his word, always uphold justice, always respect the honor and dignity of women, always defend those who were weak. And all of those values are drawn directly from the Bible, from the Old and New Testament. The medieval knight, the chivalrous man, was supposed to live a virtuous life in accordance with this code of chivalry. And if you really think about that, you begin to see why chivalry is the antidote to toxic masculinity as it's been in the news. I mean, think about these powerful men who use their power in order to exploit women. Chivalry says a man must use his power in exactly the opposite direction, to protect the people around him, to provide for the people around him. He needs to use it in a way that's pious, that's consistent with his duty toward God and toward his neighbor as well. Now, some people have objected to the very concept of chivalry because, they say, it assumes and therefore perpetuates a situation or a power dynamic in which men have more power than women. Now, as I've said, on a physical level, that is just a biological fact. Men tend to be stronger than women, and the ideal of Christian chivalry actually tries to take this fact into account, tries to deal with it in a way that's constructive, in a way that actually helps people on the ground in real life, instead of trying to construct some kind of ideology that pretends men and women aren't really different, or that fact is not there, because that doesn't deal with it in a useful way at all. And I think this objection to chivalry, though, actually kind of misses the point of chivalry on an even deeper level. Now, I'll illustrate this with a story. When I was in seminary, I lived in Dallas, Texas, and I was active in a large church there on the campus of SMU, and in our church, we had a young adult group, and I went to Sunday school and all that good stuff. And our young adult class decided to have some fun. We went bowling together. So on the way into the bowling alley, I held the door open for a young lady coming in right behind me. And it's a kind of a very memorable moment. She sort of gave me a little chastising, a little dressing down and told me she did not need a man to hold the door open for her. She was a modern, liberated woman, and she was perfectly capable of holding her own door open for herself and all this sort of thing. And I think that's kind of the way people think when they see chivalry as something bad or something negative toward women. And for somebody who was raised in a smallish city in North Louisiana, full of rednecks and country folk, this came as quite a shock to me, this experience of being chastised for holding open the door. But as I've reflected on that, I've asked myself the question, what made her think that I was doing that first and foremost for her? Could it be that that little act and other little acts like that we still refer to as chivalry, that little act of courtesy, what made her think that that was based on the idea that women were not capable of holding open their own doors? I mean, she was certainly, had arms and legs enough to hold her own door open, certainly. What if the point of those little acts of chivalry is to train me, to train the man, about how I ought to think and feel about the women around me, how I ought to approach, the attitude I ought to have toward the women in my life, toward all the women in my life? What if chivalry is not, and these little acts of courtesy and chivalry are not about compensating for the stuff that women are not capable of doing? What if it's about training the men, because we really need to be trained in how we treat women? And could it be that those powerful men in politics and Hollywood and those men who own TV studios and movie studios, could it be that if their lives had been filled with a lot more of these little acts of courtesy, these little acts that were supposed to train men by their cumulative effect in how a man ought to approach a lady? Could it be if they had a whole lot more of those little things in their lives, then when the vile temptation to exploit a woman presented itself, they would have had the training they needed to say no to that temptation? Our Lord says in Luke 16 that he who is faithful with little will also be faithful with much. And I think that's the idea behind those little acts of chivalry. The ancient Greeks and Romans and the biblical writers and the medieval Christians all understood something that I think our modern culture is only kind of remembers and kind of has forgotten, that a man or a woman has to be trained to love the things that are lovely, has to be trained to value the things that are really valuable. We are fallen sinners, and so loving what's really lovely and desiring what's really good does not always come naturally to us. In fact, sometimes our natural inclination is to do quite the opposite, because we are fallen, sinful creatures. And so we have to be trained through habit. Those right desires and those right ordering of our attitudes has to be ingrained within us through little things such as the courtesies of chivalry or the spiritual disciplines of the church. So it does no good to wish that men were not powerful creatures. God has made them so. What we need to do is channel that power in a way that's good and just and holy, and in a way that strengthens rather than breaks down community. This is what redeemed masculinity, this is what chivalry is all about. And we lose it at our peril, and I think we're beginning to see that actually in our culture. So where can you turn to learn more about this ideal of chivalry? Well, first you can obviously turn to the Bible. That's, as I've said, the foundation of it all. You can learn from the triumphs or the failures of figures such as King David in the books of Samuel or in the Psalms. You might look again with fresh eyes at the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5. You might look at Paul's exhortation to Timothy to be a good soldier for Christ and think through as a man, what does that mean? You could look at the call in Philippians chapter 2, verse 4, to self-sacrificial love and putting the needs of others above the needs of ourselves and asking ourselves, with the powers, with the skills, with the resources I have, what then does that look like? You could look at the command of Christ in the Sermon on the Mount to speak the truth and to let our yes be yes. Or you could look at Peter's rule on how men ought to relate to and honor the women in their lives in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. Or you might listen to the words of Psalm 82, verse 4, where God commands this command from heaven to rescue the weak and the needy from the hand of the wicked, and so on. The code of chivalry draws all these biblical ideals together, and the knight was expected to live by this code. It's fundamentally based on the Bible, and it's one of the great moral achievements, I would argue, of Western Christian civilization. It's one of the great moral achievements of Christendom. You can also see this ideal described in the classic literature. Everything from Shakespeare's Henry V, which has several passages which deal with this ideal of chivalry, to pretty much any book about King Arthur written before the First World War. You can see it there in the old literature as well. This is the way to address toxic masculinity, not trying to get rid of masculinity somehow or trying to teach men to be like beta males or less manly. The way to address it is to go back to the treasure trove of the Christian tradition, back to the Bible, and rediscover what chivalry is all about and what kind of vision it presents for how a boy grows into a man who takes his place in community and uses his strength for the well-being of his community. That's the idea of chivalry. Now, over the last 100 years, our culture, Western cultures, have lost its way in many respects as we've turned away from our traditions, turned away from our heritage, turned away from our faith, and turned away from our God. And I think you see this especially in any question to do with gender, with femininity, with masculinity. Our culture is very confused. We've lost our way. But whether we know it or not, we still need that old-fashioned chivalry. We need strong and godly masculinity. We need that. And here's an example. Consider this as an illustration of how our culture has changed and what we still really do need. On the 13th of January, 2012, the Italian cruise ship, the Costa Concordia, hit a rock and capsized in the Mediterranean Sea. And many on board the boat did act valiantly to help other passengers in this time of kind of chaos and in their need. But there are also reports of frantic passengers, including men, pushing smaller, weaker people out of the way as they tried desperately to save themselves. But I think the greatest example is the captain of the Costa Concordia. He was later found alone in a lifeboat, having abandoned his ship and all of his passengers without seeing to the needs of anyone else in this desperate, panicked attempt to save his own self. That's how masculinity often looks in this, our time of cultural confusion. That's how things stand. Almost exactly 100 years before, on April the 15th of 1912, the famed ocean liner Titanic sank within the icy waters of the North Atlantic. There were not nearly enough lifeboats for everyone to be saved. And so what did the men on the Titanic, these sort of Victorian men, Edwardian men who grew up on notions of Christian chivalry and tales of King Arthur, how did they react? Well, they looked at one another and they said, of course, it's women and children first. It's women and children first. They were willing to use that recklessness or that physical courage that they had as testosterone-filled men to serve the needs of others, to sacrifice themselves for the life of others. They were protectors. They were providers. They were pious. The captain of the Titanic went down with his ship, of course, because he was pious. And it was his duty as captain to see to the needs of the others on the ship before looking to his own safety. And so that's what he did. He did his duty because chivalry made all the difference. Let me leave you with two quotes that sum up everything I'm trying to say about Christian chivalry. The first is from Idylls of the King by Alfred Lord Tennyson, a kind of epic series of poems about King Arthur from the 19th century. And this is how he sums up the code of chivalry early in the book. Follow the Christ, live pure, speak true, right wrong, follow the King. And then there's the great requirement from Micah chapter 6, verse 8 in the Old Testament. This is a great code to live by today and every day. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. If we want a redeemed masculinity to take root in us, that means, among other things, we need to turn our lives over to the one who is the Redeemer, to Jesus Christ, and to begin learning from him, because the truth is we cannot live up to this ideal in our own strength. We need to draw near to the Lord and throw our hearts open to his strength, to that new creation strength flooding into our lives as we draw near to Him with prayer, with Bible study, with receiving the sacraments, and open ourselves to His strength so that our masculinity and our whole being can be redeemed. That's all for now. I hope that you have a wonderful and blessed week.